Before I ask some specific questions about Herbert Matthews, I just want to ask you, can you tell me what was going on in Cuba at the time that led up to Ms. Phillips first approaching Mr. Matthews about the Castro story? What was the atmosphere in Cuba? What were the political conditions?
Mm-hmm. Well, soon after Fidel landed in December of 1956, 50 years ago, Batista put a very strict censorship on the whole country, all of the press. So there was absolutely no news coming out about the rebels who might have survived, those who were killed, nothing but what came from the government. So there was very strict censorship, and that censorship included the foreign press. So articles that might have appeared in the New York Times that mentioned the rebels or an insurrection were clipped out of the newspaper even before they arrived in Cuba. So nothing was getting out. The scene was absolute censorship in its worst sense. Nothing was coming out. When one of Fidel's emissaries came to Havana looking for a correspondent, the only resident correspondent that he knew was Ruby Phillips. And in fact, she was the only correspondent of an American newspaper resident in Havana. And they came to her. She wasn't certain whether or not Fidel had survived, because the reports were by United Press International that he had been killed. In fact, the New York Times itself on the front page declared that Castro was dead. So there was silence from the Sierra. Nothing had come out. So she didn't know for sure whether he was alive. She didn't know whether any of the men with him had survived. There was absolute censorship, so there was no local radio or nothing in the newspapers other than what was coming from the Palacio Presidencial.
So now the contact is made with Phillips. What does she do, and why does she make the decision she makes to pass it to somebody else?
Mm-hmm. So Fidel sends an emissary from the Sierra who makes his way into Havana, asks for a meeting with Ruby Phillips. Now, this is 1957. For a woman to be a correspondent is very unusual. For a woman to be a correspondent, foreign correspondent for the New York Times is almost unheard of. But Phillips has been living in Havana since the 1930s and is a pretty tough cookie. She's known all of the presidents. She's been through several rebellions already. They come to her with the news, first off, that Fidel is alive. So she's in her office on Refugio, Calle Refugio, which is right down the street from the Palacio Presidencial. And it's usually filled with people coming in and out all day long. She shouts out, "He's alive?" And all of a sudden the emissary says, maybe we should go to some place that's a little bit more quiet. So they take her into the next room, they explain what it is. She's a little bit reluctant to believe it, but in a subsequent meeting, they provide her with more information, and she accepts the fact that Fidel is probably alive and wants to speak to a correspondent. Not necessarily Ruby Phillips or the New York Times, just a foreign correspondent. And Phillips, who has written about Fidel for many years now and has written about the disaster at Moncada in 1953, realizes that if she were to write an article saying that Fidel was alive, she would probably lose her ability to stay in Havana. So that would be 25 or 30 years of history that would go right down the drain. She says to herself, why would I risk everything that I've worked for Fidel, when I know that he's probably not going to be successful in whatever it is that he's trying to do, because she's already written about Moncada and she wrote about the disaster of the invasion. So she knows that he's not all that well organized, he's kind of a hothead and may not succeed. So she turns it down. It's not clear whether they would have taken her anyway as a woman going up into the mountains. This was before Celia Sanchez, so there are no women involved. She says no anyway, so that makes it an easy decision. The first thing she does is to offer it to her roommate, her office mate, who is a part-time correspondent for CBS Radio. And his situation is the same. He lives in Havana. He writes for the Havana Post in English and is unwilling to give up his security there in Havana for a chance at interviewing Fidel, who he doesn't really think is going to succeed anyway. So there is no one else to consider but Herbert Matthews, who writes about Latin America for the New York Times from New York, not resident in Havana, has only been there a few times, and isn't normally there, but they know that he's planning to come down for a vacation, because this is in the winter months in New York. Havana is a warm, comfortable place for Americans to go to at time. So they know he's coming, and they say, well, let's offer it to Herb.
Plus, he was a very experienced war correspondent.
By this point in 1956, 1957, he's been at the newspaper for 30 years. He's an experienced war correspondent who's sent dispatches from the Ethiopia invasion by Italy in the early 1930s. He covered the entire Spanish Civil War. He covered World War II in Italy before he was arrested, thrown in jail by Mussolini, and then released in a prisoner exchange, was then sent to India, came back to Italy during the Allied invasion of Italy, and then was based in England in the post-war, austere post-war years. He returns to New York in 1949 as an editorial writer and assumes responsibility for Latin America, which really wasn't covered by anyone before. He speaks Spanish and French and Italian, and so makes himself an expert starting in 1949. By 1957, he's visited most of the countries, met with most of the presidents in Latin America, has written editorials as well as news articles, because he has a very unusual position as both an editorial writer and as a super correspondent, able to write about many countries throughout the entire Latin American region. That was an exceptional position that had never existed before and has not existed since. It was done just for him. And so he's got a lot of experience in Latin America, and he's written some things about Cuba and about the rebellion, but none of them are very positive things. He thinks the invasion was a disaster. He calls Castro and the rebels terrorists, and he says, could anything be madder than to attempt to stage an insurrection in a country where the economy is doing well, where the president is strong, and where the army is loyal?
Okay, before we get to Cuba, just one question. Was there already some controversy connected to Matthews and his previous reporting from overseas?
Matthews was a correspondent in the mold of those correspondents of the middle of the last century. For them, objectivity didn't mean the same thing that it might mean to us today. Objectivity was something that you might try to aspire to, but nobody who was a serious correspondent at that time really believed that you could do that. You took sides, and Matthew was probably one of the most prominent proponents of that. When he was covering the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, he took sides with the Italians, and in fact, for a while, thought that fascism was a good thing. He later changed his mind. But when he covered the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Loyalists, he felt that the Loyalist government, which had been the elected government and was aligning itself with the communist, was the most valorous part of that conflict. When he then covers the Italian campaign during the Second World War, he's changed his mind about Mussolini and about the fascists. He is typical of the time, and there are others who did the same thing. Ernest Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn, and the others. They felt that to be objective and unbiased was to be bloodless in your writing. So in order to infuse your writing with emotion, you had to take sides. And Matthews did that. He was an ideologue. But you can see, going from fascism to the communist, he went from the extreme right to the extreme left, and would go wherever. He also had a romantic streak, not so much idealistic, but just an admiration for strong men, military men, people who were affecting history, and he wanted to have his part in it.
Okay, so fast forward again to Cuba. Phillips approaches him I forget if she told him directly or if it came through the people in New York. When he first hears about it, is it something he wants to jump on right away, or was he reluctant?
Yeah. Let me just go back to his earlier career. He was criticized for that bias that he showed, even though it was a fairly common thing to do then. During the African campaign, he was criticized for basically playing up the fascist side when sentiment in the United States was basically for the underdog, which was the Africans under Haile Selassie. In the Spanish Civil War, he was taking the side of the loyalist. In the United States, the Catholic lobby resented his coverage very much because the loyalist had a difficult and troublesome relationship with the church. There were murders of priests and nuns, and his reporting was not trusted. Even though he was on the scene and he was on the front lines, the New York Times also had a correspondent covering Franco. And when those two reports came together, the editors doubted what Matthews had sent because his reporting seemed to be so aligned with the side that he was covering. So he got into a lot of battles with his own editors. He got into battles with Catholics in the United States over his coverage. By the time you get to 1957 and the problems arising in Cuba, Matthews is already 57 years old, an editorial writer, no longer a war correspondent, but eager to get back in the field, eager to show that he can still do it, that he can still run with the younger correspondents. So when this opportunity comes up, he's very interested, and it also seems to him one more shot, perhaps a last shot, at a gigantic scoop, and so he jumps at the opportunity immediately. He gets a secret message from Ruby Phillips. Remember, because there's censorship, not only the material coming into Cuba, but all of the messages going out. So Ruby Phillips can't send a dispatch to New York by telex because it would have to go through the government offices. So she can't say, I know that Fidel is alive because one of his men came to see me and you should come down because there's a chance to interview him. All she can do is send a message to Matthews in New York saying, come now. And he reads between the lines, he has other contacts, and so he comes immediately at the beginning of February 1957, lands in Havana under the guise of being an American on vacation. Actually is accompanied by his wife, Nancy, and for all the world, when they check into the Hotel Sevilla Biltmore, there are two Americans there for a midwinter vacation. He spends a week interviewing officials in Havana, including all of the American officials at the embassy, including the principal businessmen of Cuba, and also speaks to some of the dissident groups about what's going on, and gets from all of them estimates of how many men there might be in the Sierra. No one knows for sure, not even the people at the embassy, whether or not Fidel is alive, but they know that he has supporters there. And at the end of that week, as he's waiting for someone of Fidel's men to come and contact him, he gathers all this information and actually goes out and buys clothing that would be appropriate for an American going down on a fishing trip. So he spends a week waiting in the Hotel Sevilla Biltmore, right in Havana Vieja, waiting for Castro's men. Finally, on Friday night, at the end of that week, they show up at around 10 o'clock at night, tell him to load the car, and they begin this cross-country trip. It's Matthews and his wife in the back, and Faustino Perez, and another woman in the front, and Javier Pasos, the son of Felipe Pasos, who was the original contact. They drive overnight the 500 miles from Havana to Santiago. During that time, these young rebels, who are half of Matthew's age or less, are telling him about their movement, about Fidel, about what they hope to accomplish. They're singing revolutionary songs. And so it's part of an indoctrination that is apparently very effective, because although Matthews wrote against Fidel and the rebels in his editorials before he got to Havana. By the time he gets there, he's much more in tune with what it is that they're trying to do. They get through the roadblocks that Batista has put up around the mountains by pretending to be Americans on vacation. The soldiers look in, the soldiers look in, they see Matthews and his wife, who's dressed in American clothing, she's got a dress on, and a chimney pot hat of the style of the 1950s, and they realize that she's not any danger, so they allow the car to go through. Matthews is brought to a safe house in Manzanillo. His wife stays behind, and he's then picked up by another group of rebels who have come down from the Sierra to bring him up to see Castro. And that's the beginning of the final leg of the story.
So you think this whole elaborate plan that they had, he got caught up in all that and being part of it? Do you think that that was part of the, it was an exciting trip, I'm in on this huge exclusive, do you think that's why he maybe got caught up in becoming maybe a part of the story? Or that
No, I think that's a sort of a softening up period. And maybe whatever remained of his professional skepticism, where he had written originally about them being terrorists and about the movement being soft-headed, that starts to melt away as the adrenaline builds up about the excitement of actually getting to meet someone who he's never seen, he's never heard. In the New York Times, I think they've run one photograph of him prior to this, and the photograph was to announce that he was killed in the invasion. So he doesn't really know much. And he's gotten estimates from various people who he interviewed in Havana about Fidel's strengths and his many weaknesses. But as a correspondent, in a situation like that, it would happen to anyone. Your adrenaline starts to pump, you become excited and wrapped up in the story, whatever it is, and you're hoping that it will be as good a story as it can possibly be. When he leaves Nancy behind, they then have to cross through much more restrictive barricades set up by Batista's men. And they're successful. In this case, he's changed into other clothing, and he becomes now an American planter looking to purchase land in Oriente province, where there are lots of big plantations. They look at him and they allow him to go through. The rebels are also bringing in money to Fidel. They ask Matthews to hold it, because if for some reason they're stopped and searched, it might not be so unreasonable for an American coming in to have $400 on him. So he actually agrees, and in that case becomes not just a reporter, but in part a participant in the whole scheme. They get into the mountains. He then rendezvous with some of the men, including Juan Almeida, who actually came across with Fidel from Mexico. But they don't actually find Fidel or the men around him. And Matthews has to spend the night in the Sierra, cold. It's been raining during the day, so it's damp. They put a blanket out for him, but he can't sleep. He's kind of hungry. They offer him a couple of crackers and some ham. And they continue to tell him stories about what they're fighting for, about the atrocities of Batista, about Fidel and Raul and what they intend to do. And Matthews has to wait all the way until dawn of the next morning, when finally they hear the whistles, the double-tone whistle of the men they're waiting for, who are giving them the signal that it's time to come up. So just before dawn, he makes his climb up this final cliff. At the edge of this cliff and a plateau that's been cleared for them, there's a meeting spot. And just after dawn, as the sun is coming up, as the last drops of rain are falling off of the brush and the wawasi trees that are there, Fidel comes through the undergrowth, carrying a telescopic rifle, wearing fatigues, with a hat on, with the sun behind him, and Matthews is overwhelmed.
How was the greeting? Can you describe how What was he? Did he write specifically about his reaction, or he just went straight into the interview?
His notes are incomplete about that. He doesn't have a tape recorder. It's 1957. There's no account of the meeting from Fidel, contemporary account of the details of what went on. We do know that Fidel comes out with a rifle, and one of the first things he does is start to brag about the rifle and his marksmanship, and how with this rifle they can pick off one of Batista's soldiers at 100 yards. We can imagine what it was like, knowing Fidel's personality, and also knowing Matthew's personality and his weakness for strong men. So there's a greeting. He's waited now a week to have this meeting. He's been up all night. Well, we can assume that Fidel has been sleeping all night, so Fidel is fresh. Matthews is excited and tired and hungry and probably kind of muddy and dirty, and all of the advantage immediately shifts to Fidel's side. Matthews knows something about Fidel. Fidel knows almost nothing about Matthews except his name and the fact that he writes for the New York Times, which Fidel has some sense of how important it is. The interview lasts 3 hours, from 6 until 9. Matthews takes notes, not in a notebook, but in 7 sheets of folded, lined paper, which I had the opportunity to handle and to look at. He saved them, and they're still in the archives. The notes are rough. They're in a combination of Spanish and English. They're basically some of his own reactions. In one case, he says about the men surrounding him, how young. And he's by far the oldest person there. Fidel at this point is only 30. Matthews is 57. Most of the men with Fidel are in their mid-20s. So he's taken by that. He writes about the rifle. He asks Fidel how many men he has with him. Fidel doesn't lie outright, but he doesn't give him an answer that's absolutely accurate either. He says to him, and it becomes an important point of the controversy later on, he says, Batista fights in columns of 200. I won't tell you how many men we have for obvious reasons, but we fight in columns of 40. And we're winning. Now, Matthews can observe some of the men around Fidel. He's met Juan Almeida. He sees Raul Castro, and he notes that he's seen these people. And so you might ask, how could it be that he allowed Fidel to say that in the article when we know now, because Fidel later on told us, that there were no more than 18 men with him. Those are the survivors of the invasion. Well, the reason it comes up is because besides meeting with Matthews, Fidel is using this meeting to bring together all of the people from the urban underground in Havana and Santiago and to get together with them for the very first time since he landed in December. So there are other people around that Matthews has seen in the safe house and has seen in the general area of the place where the meeting takes place. Also, during the time that he spent in Havana, he met with the people at the U.S. Embassy who told him that they believed that there were several hundred rebels in the mountains. He knew that in the New York Times, there had been an article published that quoted the representative of the 26th of July movement in New York saying that there were several hundred men in the mountains who were loyal to Fidel. And he knew that Ruby Phillips had sent secret information by way of a letter that friends carried out from Havana to Miami and then mailed to New York, that she believed that there were several hundred sympathizers in the mountains, whether or not Fidel was alive. So he had all those estimates. He had an observation of some of the men who were around, and he had Castro saying that we fight in columns of 40. In the middle of it, Castro also sends, or has this arranged, Raul sends a message to someone else. This person comes over and interrupts and says, Mi comandante, the column number 2 is reporting. And Castro turns to him and says, not now, can't you see I'm busy? Well, there is no column 2 because there are only 18 men. But that's part of the guerrilla theater that Castro has set up. Now, after he's victorious in April of 1959, after Batista has left and Castro has won, he comes to the United States and he addresses a group of reporters at the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington. And there, with Matthews in the audience for the first time, Fidel tells the story of how he fooled the New York Times by marching his 18 men around Matthews in circles during the interview. And he has a big laugh about it and creates a myth that to this day, 50 years later, most people believe. But the evidence from the contemporary accounts, evidence from Matthews' notes, and evidence of where the interview actually took place, which I had a chance to see last year, all of it indicates that it's very unlikely that there was any marching around in circles. Because if they had tried to do that, the soldiers who marched around would have fallen right off a cliff.
So we really don't know if Castro was telling the truth or not. I mean, what do you think his motivation was for telling that story if it's not true?
Well, at that time, remember, he's just one person in the mountains with 18 men. He's attempting to get across the idea of how many people he has. Later on in 1959, he's already victorious.
Right, that's what I mean.
But if he can prove through this story that he was able to fool the New York Times, it's an indication of his expertise, his cleverness, his ability to fool, if not just the New York Times, then all of the United States. So remember, he's always, while he hasn't said he's communist by this point, he is anti-imperialist, and that's a big motivation. So to be able to fool the Yankees, to fool the U.S. government, or to fool the United States by way of the New York Times is for him a big accomplishment. And he starts it then and he continues it today, 50 years later. The interview gets cut short after about 3 hours because one of Batista's planes comes overhead at about 9 o'clock. One of the rebels who's with Fidel, I mean, all of them are wearing pretty rough clothing because they had to leave most of their supplies and uniforms on the Granma, which ran aground. So they didn't have much. One of them is wearing a white shirt, a very ragged white shirt, in tatters, being held together by rope. But in the forest, in the deep woods of the Sierra, a white shirt stands out like a white flag. So when this plane goes overhead, somebody has to pull him in. This one soldier, one rebel wearing the white shirt, pull him in so that he's not seen by the plane going overhead. It's another indication that there could never have been an attempt to fool Matthews by marching the same guys over and over again, because one person wearing a white shirt would stand out. He certainly would have seen it, a correspondent who had already had 35 years experience. So that's another reason why I don't believe that it ever happened. So the plane goes overhead, they pull the man with the white shirt out, and that's a signal that they're going to end. Fidel assures Matthews that he's going to protect him. So he makes his way out of the mountains. And in fact, let me point out that he's not actually deep into the mountains. He's in the foothills. Castro has come down from Pico Torquino down to an area outside of Manzanillo where he has this meeting. He brings Castro sends men to bring Matthews through the Batista's security ring. They go back to the safe house. He picks up his wife. They do a few interviews in Santiago and then get on a plane to Havana, where he does other interviews. And there in Havana, at this point, after having seen Fidel, he meets with Antonio Echeverria, who's the head of the student movement, in an apartment, and they talk about their plans. So Matthews is aware that Fidel is not the only person attempting to overthrow Batista. They're worried about getting his notes out of Havana because they're explosive. They indicate that he met with Fidel. In fact, based on his experience in Spain, where people didn't believe his dispatches, before he leaves, he takes his notes, which are written on these 7 pages of lined paper, and he hands them to Fidel and asks Fidel to put his signature on them and the date, which Fidel does, in order to authenticate the meeting, knowing that there will be doubters. So this is explosive material. He's got to get from his hotel to the airport, on the plane, and out to New York. So he's worried about where to hide them. His wife, Nancy, says, "Don't worry about it. Give them to me. I'll take care of it." So she takes the notes and she puts them in her girdle, knowing that none of the security guards will attempt to find it there. They safely get on the plane, and while they're on the plane heading back to New York, she goes, excuses herself, comes out with the notes, and he starts to put his story together on the plane heading back to New York.
Now, that signature and the pictures that they took would be important later because the authenticity of the interview was questioned, especially by Batista's people, right?
The article appears on a Sunday, February 24th, 1957, a week after the interview, on the front page of the Sunday New York Times, which is about as big a platform as you can get. And imagine the reaction to an article that says, this person who we thought was dead is actually alive. And not only is he alive, but he is this big, heroic figure leading a rebellion in Cuba that has the support of all of Cuba's youth. This is 1957, just before the beginning of the 1960s. And to me, it seems that what Matthews is doing is actually painting Fidel as a precursor of the 1960s youth movement. He's there, he shows up with a beard, long hair, a rifle, anti-establishment feelings. He's going to overthrow the corrupt dictator, and he's going to create some sort of a paradise there. Sounds very much like the 1960s. The article comes out, of course it can't be seen in Cuba because of the censorship that Batista has, but Batista has access to it and he knows about it. His defense minister, who's already put out the story that Fidel was killed in the invasion, calls the article and the claim that Matthews met with Fidel a chapter in a fantastic novel. Absolutely denies that Fidel is alive or that Matthews did anything like having an interview with him, and says, well, isn't it strange that if Matthews claimed to have an interview with Fidel, there was no photograph in the article of Matthews with Fidel? And so therefore it lays out a challenge. A few days later, the New York Times takes a photograph that was taken by one of the rebels up in the mountains with a small box camera that Matthews had brought with him. And it is a photograph that shows Matthews and Fidel together, but the quality of it was poor because it wasn't a professional photographer, it wasn't even a professional camera. So the paper had decided originally not to use it. But based on this challenge, they then take this photograph, touch it up so that it becomes at least passable, and runs it in the paper. And there is Matthews sitting next to Fidel, taking notes on the lined paper, both of them engrossed in conversation. Well, even that isn't enough to satisfy Batista's men. He says, well, that could be anyone, anywhere. And besides, look at him, he's wearing a heavy coat. It's Cuba in February. This is probably somebody in Cyprus and not in Cuba. Batista was told by all of his advisors that Fidel was dead. So he's trying to get over the idea that, one, his people lied to him, and two, his nemesis is alive and getting this kind of coverage. So he reluctantly finally comes to agree to it, lifts the censorship, because by the Constitution he only had 45 days to allow the censorship to go on. But even before the censorship is lifted, Castro's men had sent an envoy to New York. This envoy collected all 3 articles that ran in this series, had them printed on a single sheet, and with a copy of the social registry from Havana, mails out 3,000 copies of it to 3,000 very important people in Havana, who then know about it, and the resulting reaction to these articles is, as one Cuban told me who lived through it, electric, absolutely electric. Here is word, here is proof that Fidel is alive, that he's got men behind him, that he's fought battles up in the mountains, that he intends to overthrow the government, and that he has ideals that are general enough that all these many people who are against Batista feel that they can identify with him. Electric.
Did the article also serve to kind of create a new Fidel? Because I think in the eyes of a lot of people, he had kind of like a gangster type reputation up until then. Did this completely?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Let me just say this. What was his reputation before then, and how did the article change his reputation?
Yeah. Remember, Ruby Phillips turned down the opportunity to go interview him because she knew him as a hot-headed, gun-slinging hoodlum who had not planned the Moncada attack very well, who ended up getting most of his men killed, who was considered a gangster at the University of Havana, who had been involved in lots of questionable dealings. And she understood that image, as did lots of people. He had been jailed for 2 years and was generally considered so idealistic and so violent that a lot of people were turned off by it. But Matthews, whether or not he knew that, doesn't mention any of it in the articles and presents Fidel, the easiest way to say it is as a Robin Hood, a guy, an outlaw in the mountains who's there to rob from the rich, meaning Batista, and to give to the poor. And he presents such a convincing image of Fidel that it endows him with a whole new identity. Other American reporters, and in fact journalists from around the world, follow Matthews' footsteps up into the mountains. And almost without exception, they come back with the same story. Robin Hood attempting to lead an outlaw life up in the mountains, but intent only on overthrowing the government and bringing justice to Cuba. Well, the immediate impact is to elevate Fidel from one of several dissident leaders to a focal point of the opposition to Batista. As I mentioned, Matthews had also interviewed Echeverria. Antonio Echeverria, and the student movement was actually larger, was actually better organized, and was actually more intent on overthrowing the government than was Fidel. And one of the immediate responses to the articles was 2 weeks later, after having been planned for over a year, the attack on Batista's palace by the students suddenly takes place. And it seems to have been rushed a little bit into action because Echeverria and the others were afraid that Fidel was becoming singularly too powerful. So they launched this attack, and it's a disaster because someone has squealed on them and told Batista. And Echeverria and most of the others are killed, and Batista survives the attempt on his life. So what it does in Cuba is to elevate Fidel to a different status, not just as one of many rebel movements, because Prio Socarrás also had his group that was intent on overthrowing Batista, and there were several others. Fidel suddenly becomes the summit of the opposition. Over a longer term, what happens is this also creates support for Fidel and 26 de Julio movement in the United States. And that provides money, that provides arms, and very importantly, it provides pressure on the United States Congress to do something about continued U.S. arms sales to Batista. And so by the middle of 1958, finally, with all of this pressure from Americans on Congress to end arms shipments, in fact, that finally happens, with the understanding in the State Department of the United States that a movement like that, an action to withhold arms sales, is going to be seen in Cuba as a withdrawal of support for Batista. And in fact, that's what happens, and the end comes pretty soon thereafter. At that point in 1957, The front page of the Sunday New York Times is about as powerful a platform as you can get. For Fidel and Che Guevara, that interview and its placement and the way it was written ends up, and Che says this in his diary, ends up being more decisive for them than any battle, because of all of those things that we talked about in terms of elevating him to a different stature, of providing money and support. The reason it's so important is because in 1957, print is still the king. Television exists, but it hadn't yet eclipsed the power of the print medium. There's no 24-hour newscast. There's no all-news radio. There's no internet. There are no remote transmissions for television. Just getting to a place is difficult enough. So Matthews ends up being a print superstar because of this article. And the article itself ends up being replicated by many other newspapers in the United States. And the story that Matthews tells is picked up because it's given legitimacy. Once it appears on the front page of the New York Times, it's given legitimacy that it wouldn't have otherwise. Both the article itself and the movement, and primarily Fidel. So if it's been in the New York Times, then it becomes okay for all of the other newspapers and organizations to follow up and present the same kind of story about Fidel.
Just a couple more questions here. Now, Matthews not only has the influence of being a reporter and having his byline, but then he has a dual role. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's very unusual for this to happen, but Matthews, while he's writing these articles, and will continue to write articles about Cuba throughout the rest of the fighting, and then for the first year and a half after Fidel comes into Havana. But at the same time, he's writing editorials. Now, the editorials are never signed, so they don't say Herbert Matthews on it, but we know, based on interviews and based on Matthews' own declarations and the declarations of other people who worked with him on the editorial board, that he was responsible for Latin America. So any article, any editorial that might have been written about Cuba during this period of time would have been written by Herbert Matthews. And so what he's doing is he changes, after this interview, from defending Batista as being strong and in control of the government, in control of the army, and while he may have been corrupt, at least he was a friend of the United States. After the interview, he presents Batista in a very negative light, condemns the attempts at censorship, condemns the increasing violence as Batista tries to counter the rebels, and eventually calls for his ouster and declares in the editorial pages that his days are numbered. That combination of articles in the newspaper building up the support for Fidel, showing how important he is and how many supporters he has, and the editorials basically doing the same thing, are a powerful 1-2 punch that really turns the tide. Interestingly, during the same time, Ruby Phillips continues to work in Havana. She's got much more distance from Fidel, never having really met him since he got into the Sierra, never having dealt with him other than to report on some of his actions. And she keeps a more objective stance. So there are moments when the New York Times is actually writing and publishing articles from both of them. In one case, Ruby Phillips saying Batista still has control of things and has managed to quell the violence, in particular after the assassination attempt, while at the same time, in the same day, in the same paper, Herbert Matthews is writing an article talking about Havana being ready to burst into revolutionary flames. And so there's a real conflict there, and that causes difficulties for the New York Times.
By that time, had the die been cast? People were going with what Matthews had to say because...
Very much so. Very much so. But remember that at that time, from 1957 to 1959, Castro is a hero in the United States. He is seen as a young idealist who's fighting to overthrow a corrupt dictator. It's a good story. We still like those kinds of people until we know exactly what it is that they're up to.
So as Castro comes into power and all the executions start to come up and the Soviets start to come in and they're doing East German expos and everything that's happening, does Matthews change his reporting based on what's happening in Cuba, or does he continue?
Mm-hmm. Soon after Castro shows up in Havana, in fact, before Castro shows up in Havana, the United States has already officially, diplomatically recognized the new government. So we are attempting to embrace them, although there's some uneasiness with Fidel. And there had been a couple of last-minute attempts by the White House through special envoys that President Eisenhower sent to Havana to effect a transition that would have prevented Fidel from taking over. So there's some suspicion, but generally, by the time he shows up in Washington in April with members of his cabinet, the members of his cabinet that he brings are moderates, people from previous governments, people who had held position in the central bank, who were respected economists. And despite a little bit of unease caused by the executions of Batista supporters in the early weeks after the triumph of the revolution, Washington is attempting to be cautious, not rush headlong into anything, but still thinking that perhaps they might be able to work with him. Eisenhower doesn't meet with Castro, but Nixon does. And his opinion at the end is that, well, yeah, I've got some problems with him, but I think he's somebody we can work with. Matthews, of course, during all this time, continues to write about the revolution and Castro in positive terms. He alone, however, is attempting to present what's happening as a real social revolution, as opposed to a simple rebellion in which one government is ousted, a new government comes in and basically runs things the same way. He thinks that Castro has something else in mind. And by May of 1959, when the agricultural reform law is passed and some of the land begins to be confiscated, that really is the signal that something has gone awry. And most of the other journalists by this point are starting to look at the signs and eventually will come over to presenting the revolutionary government as being aligned with the communist. Matthews, however, takes a very academic approach to it, most likely because he had already presented Castro as not being communist in any way. So he defines communist government as a government that's taking orders from the International Central Communist Committee, which he says Castro is not doing. Well, technically he was right, but realistically, things had already progressed where the communists within the government were having more control, Raúl and Che and the others. And as things got stickier with Washington, Castro was moving more towards embracing and being embraced by the Soviet Union. Matthews, as late as June of 1960, writes an article that appears on the front page of the newspaper stating boldly that the revolution is not communist in any sense of the word. By that point, in June of 1960, he's alone. He's the only one marching to that tune. And he continues to cling to that idea, that concept, until just before the Bay of Pigs. In April of 1961, Castro declares the socialist aims of the revolution as he's trying to rally Cubans after the first bombardment takes place. And by the end of that year, in December of 1961, Castro gives a long speech that's monitored in Miami by a Cuban exile for the United Press International. And things get pretty confused. And the report that actually appears in English that Saturday has Castro declaring that I am now and I've always been a Marxist-Leninist, which causes great embarrassment for Matthews. He says later on that it was the worst day of his life, and he had considered jumping off a bridge.
We
There was
don't know
confusion.
to this day whether that was really the statement.
Well, we know, based on going back through the record, that those reports were inaccurate. And in fact, in typical fashion, Castro was talking for 5 hours in a convoluted stream of consciousness way of speaking. There was nothing written down. But the transcript of the speech indicates that what he was saying was actually apologizing for not having been a Marxist-Leninist all of his life. That, in fact, when he was in college, he had read some of the books by Marx, and he liked the idea of somehow working together or having some alternative to a capitalist society. But he declares, even 15 years later, in a conversation with students in Chile, was I a communist that time when I was in college? Not by a long shot. And it's not until sometime in the late part of 1960 to 1961 that we know for sure that he had actually embraced it. But what does that mean? Embraced it in which way? Because he actually believed in those things? Well, having observed him for all these years, I tend to agree with those who say that he wears communism the way a man wears a suit, because for that particular occasion, it suits him. It was a way for him to stick a thumb in the eye of the United States. When he took over in 1959, he didn't have a party. He did not have a political party. So the Communist Party of Cuba, which had existed for a long time, served that purpose. And as relations with the United States tended to deteriorate, he saw great advantage in declaring his communist leanings and moving closer to the Soviets. The Soviets, of course, had many advantages to take by having a country so close to the United States aligned with it.
Do you think that Matthews, by continuing to report the way that he did, continued to have a significant impact, or by that point, it wasn't really going to make a difference?
By that point, the impact that he had was mostly an impact on the New York Times, which was, because of Matthews' work, so closely aligned with the revolution that it caused internal problems in the way the New York Times was able to gather the news. Over a longer term, it had an impact on relations between the two countries and basically our strategic interest. And what I mean by that is, because of this linkage and the accusations that somehow Matthews and the New York Times were responsible for bringing communism into the Western Hemisphere by helping Castro take over, when the New York Times reporters in early 1961 had information about the preparations for an invasion of Cuba that we later knew as the Bay of Pigs, there was reluctance on the part of the editors to print that information, lest they be accused again of having aided Castro by giving him advance warning. So part of the hesitation that they showed in putting out that information, and the information they had was very specific. They knew exactly the date that the invasion was planned. They knew the place. They knew the rough outlines of what the U.S. Participation was going to be. That article, when it finally ran, was watered down with those specifics taken out. And the managing editor and the publisher who made those decisions indicated in memos that I saw that part of their hesitation was based on the fact that they were already too closely aligned with Cuba because of Matthews' work. Afterwards, President Kennedy said to the managing editor, "I wish you had gone ahead and printed the story the way you had it. It might have saved us a lot of embarrassment." And of course, many deaths and untold advantage that it actually gave to Fidel. After 1961, he was not allowed to write about Cuba in the news pages any longer. So there were no bylines anymore with his name on it. He continued to write editorials about Cuba. And, in fairness, in some cases, he was critical of Fidel for being too reckless, for taking too many chances, for being contradictory in some of the things that he did. But mostly the editorials were supportive. They were not signed, but he was allowed to continue to write them. And in fact, he was allowed to continue at the newspaper until 1967 when he retired. He was not forced out. He was not banished. But for a newspaper reporter and a correspondent of many years who was particularly incensed whenever a government, be it the Spanish government, the Italian government, or Batista's government, intended to or attempted to impose censorship, that was something that he always fought against. The difficulty for him to accept what in effect was censorship from his own paper was something that made him uneasy for the rest of his life. He continued to have access to Fidel. In fact, he was one of the only Americans who had that close of an access and was able to talk to him after the Bay of Pigs and leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and many other opportunities afterwards. And Matthews continued to attempt to bring that information to the newspaper and wrote articles and submitted them, hoping that even though there was this prohibition against him writing and this de facto censorship, that the importance, the historic importance of what he had would overcome that. But in fact, he was never allowed to do that and oftentimes had to take that information and publish it in other publications, which got him into even more hot water. He retired in 1967, and the first thing he did upon retirement was to write a biography of Fidel Castro, and was accused again when that book was published of being an apologist and not being able to let go of this story, nor to be able to acknowledge the fact that he was wrong.
Now, my last question, if you care to give me your opinion now, you've been telling me the facts of what happened. The title of your book is The Man Who Invented Fidel. Do you think he invented him, and was he motivated by anything other than what he I know you said in the book a couple of times that he never felt that he knowingly was inaccurate.
Right.
Was that in fact the case, and do you think he had an ulterior motive for his reporting?
Right. Let me answer that last question first. Ulterior motive, be it political or financial or ideological, no. There's no evidence that he had any communist sympathies, never belonged to it, never gave money to it. There were many accusations, none of them were proved. Even though J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI firmly believed that he was a communist, there's no evidence that he was. He was, if anything, an idealist. He was, if anything, someone who believed that government could work to the benefit of the underdog. And in the end, he was a romantic from the time he was a child who was awed by men who were powerful enough to affect history. You know, journalists are surrounded by history, and we write about history and historic events, but rarely do we ever have the opportunity to make history ourselves. Matthews stood at the center of a pivotal moment in our history, in hemispheric relations, and by his actions, he actually helped to shape history. And I think in the end, for someone like him, who was not content to just explain the world, but in fact wanted to change it, that, despite all the trouble that it caused him, was the crowning achievement of his career, because he was able to affect history. He didn't do it by setting out to do that. He did it by continuing the kind of work that he'd always done, which was basically to report whatever it is that he saw and to report only what he believed to be the truth at the time that he wrote it. Can we accuse him of having written things that turned out to be something other than the truth? I think so. But how much blame can you assign to him if, in fact, the truth changed? If, in fact, Fidel didn't know exactly what he wanted to do in 1957. In fact, his ideas about politics and the economy and governance were badly formed and rudimentary. And evolved over time in order to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish, which was essentially to gain and then to retain power. Matthews didn't know that, or at least he didn't report that. But biographies of Castro that were written as recently as last year, 50 years later, still can't answer that question with absolute certainty. So I think it's unreasonable to have expected Matthews to do that. He was caught in history. He acted to shape history. He invented the idea of Castro as an idea, as a myth that could be shaped. And in the end, what he showed us is the great power and the great danger of myths, which can be more dangerous, far more dangerous than lies.